to the Flipping and Wholesaling Houses in New York show. I am Michael Pinter, where I teach you how to start flipping or wholesaling houses in New York, or if you're already doing it, how to grow your business. Got a question about how does FSBO, for sale by owner, how does that work for the buyer? So I'm going to talk about how it works in most states, in 49 states, and how it works in New York, because it's dramatically different. So a couple things to understand. The way real estate is transacted in New York is different than the other 49 states. The way a real estate transaction occurs in 49 states is between a buyer and a seller. Buyer meets a seller. Buyer says, I want to give you $500,000 for your house. Seller says, okay. Buyer can whip out a contract, sign the contract, and you are now in contract. You may or may not even have to give a deposit. You may give a deposit that the seller never deposits. You may give a check for the deposit that the seller never actually deposits in his bank. Doesn't matter. You're still in contract. But both parties, because it's so easy to get into the contract, really can get out of the contract easier than you think. Now, again, in certain states, as a investor, you're going to want to protect yourself by, my desk is a mess, by recording the contract or recording an affidavit of contract or a memorandum of contract, depends what county and what state you're in, to protect yourself in case that seller changes his mind. But even if you do that, it's not an ironclad deal. Now, the way a real estate transaction takes place in New York is dramatically different. Buyer and seller agree on a price. At that point, the seller engages an attorney who generates a contract, sends it to a buyer's attorney. So the real estate transaction really takes place between a seller's attorney and a buyer's attorney. And then they negotiate. That takes time. They each take, significant fees for their work. And then you're in contract. At that point in New York, it's impossible, as close to impossible, unless you've written specific contingencies into the contract, it's impossible to get out of the contract. So what's very common in 49 states is that for a buyer to put in an inspection contingency, I need 14 days to do an inspection. I'm going to send an inspector there. I'm going to see if I want this. If I don't like it, I get out. They call that in California, they call that in escrow, and there's usually a way out of escrow. In New York, inspections get done before the contract is signed. So if we agree on a price and I want to buy your house, I would do an inspection now. If there were any repairs that I wanted, I would put that in as an addendum to the contract. So there's no inspection contingency. Now, what is the only typical contingency on a standard retail seller to buyer transaction is going to be a mortgage contingency. That's typical. It doesn't happen all the time, and it certainly doesn't happen to any of my contracts when I'm buying a property. When I buy a property, I have no contingency, so I have no way out. I either have to assign the contract, if it's assignable, or I have to close on the property, which is fine. Talk about assignability, another issue, and we haven't talked about FSBO at all, for sale by owner, but we'll get to that soon. Standard contracts in New York are not assignable, right? Standard contracts in 49 states, there's really no boilerplate language because the buyer just brings his own contract, and if it doesn't say that a contract is not assignable, it is assignable. However, Clause 26 in the standard New York State contract says no assignability, so something you need to negotiate with or get changed. Now, when a for sale by owner situation happens in 49 states, it's really similar to anything else that happens in 49 states. It's a transaction taking place between you and the guy whose sign you saw in front of his lawn or who you saw listed for sale by owner on Zillow, whatever that is, and it's a regular transaction. But in New York, it's very different. Right now, you can transact real estate in New York without using attorneys. You can, either as a buyer or as a seller. But understand that is not because that's not typical. If there's any problem the other side has, so as a seller, if you sell a property, for example, and you didn't use an attorney, and the buyer says, you screwed me, you materially did not tell me that there was a problem here that I didn't know about, that maybe even you didn't know about as a seller, and the guy would sue you, you have to understand, because there was no attorneys involved and because you didn't protect yourself, right? What happens, just to tell you what happens in New York, is usually we give a $500 property condition disclosure. Right, and that basically exonerates a seller from anybody coming back to them after. Right, you have option. The basic option, and I don't know if this takes place in all 50 states, but in New York, the option is you can waive that $500, and then you could get sued if the guy finds a plumbing problem or sewer problem that he can prove that you knew about, which is hard. Or you just basically give a $500 credit to the buyer, and then you have no liability as a seller. But if you didn't know that, and if you didn't use standard contracts, and if you didn't use an attorney, as a seller, that is a liability. As a buyer, if you bought a deal, right, let's say you do what I do, and bought a deal at a discount, and that seller did not have an attorney representing them, then that seller can come back and say, oh, you took advantage of me, you screwed me. And you've got to understand, Either of those cases, if you didn't use an attorney, you'd have a strong case because the way the real estate was transaction was just not typical. One party or both parties were not represented by counsel. So the way it should work for a buyer on a for sale by owner is the buyer should say, I'm using an attorney. I assume you have an attorney. And if not, you should get an attorney. The seller decides not to get an attorney. That's his right. And I've closed deals where I bought properties where there was no attorney. So, but a couple of things happened. First of all, my attorney prepared a very strongly worded affidavit for the seller, explaining that they have chosen not to be represented by counsel and that they are exonerating me from any liability because of that. That's number one. Number two is you've got to understand that both a buyer's attorney and a seller's attorney in any transaction is typically responsible for doing certain things. So, for example, there could be title issues that show up in an ordinary case. It's even if in a situation where it's free and clear and there's no payoffs. But let's take all situations. So a typical situation is there is a mortgage on a property. Someone has to order that payoff letter to find out exactly how much needs to be paid off before the closing. That's what a seller's attorney would do. If there's no seller's attorney, the seller has to do it or the buyer has to do it. Someone has to do that. And very typical, if there's no attorneys, you get to the closing and no one ordered the payoff and it may not come right away and you may get screwed up at closing. Even if there's no payoffs, what happens a lot is on title, an old mortgage that was paid off will still show up. Someone needs to get paperwork to show that that mortgage was paid off. Now, if it's over 40 or 50 years, usually an affidavit is fine. But let's say it was 20 years old, right? Maybe it was a 15-year mortgage, but you don't know that. Or let's say it was the 30-year mortgage that you paid off early because you refinanced or whatever it is. And what happens, what should happen is that anytime a mortgage is paid off, a satisfaction gets generated. That's a document from the lien holder, from the mortgage holder, and that satisfaction gets recorded in the county, and that basically negates the mortgage. But very often, in the crazy busy times, satisfaction either doesn't get recorded, or an original gets sent to the seller and he never bothers to record it, or he throws it out, or it gets recorded wrong. Maybe they put the wrong section block and lot, so it gets attached to a different property. These things happen all the time. So if the seller doesn't have an attorney, then it falls on either you, the buyer, on a FSBO situation, or your attorney to take care of that. But your attorney's not going to even think about taking care of it because a typical situation is a seller's attorney. So let me tell you a quick story. I had a couple of situations that I thought were great where I had sellers who said they didn't want attorneys. And let me tell you, it was not so easy, right? In one case, it was I needed to get death certificates. Somebody had died. It was an estate situation. And I don't deal with that stuff. It's always the seller's attorney that does that. But of course, we got to 2 days before the closing. Title company said, where are these death certificates? And I had to go get original death certificates. Now, another situation that happened is that when I met with the buyers, it was a brother and sister, they asked me for everything 50-50. Now, what happens typically on a closing in New York is that the seller's attorney prepares a checklist, a list of checks. And he would have said 50% for the brother, 50% for the sister. I didn't remember that. We got to the closing, at one check, they were all upset at me. I didn't remember that. But again, that's something that a seller's attorney would do. Now, if it's a buyer, if you're not, there's a lot of things the buyer's going to do, right? The buyer's attorney is going to come up with all the numbers to figure out how much the buyer needs to bring. You got to understand closing costs in New York are significant. So if you're getting a loan, it's typical for me, even if I'm not getting a loan, to have at least $10,000 in costs. So what are those closing costs? They're going to be title charges. They are going to be taxes that need to be adjusted. You may have to pay the seller for any prepaid taxes that they paid. They may be taxes that are due shortly that you're going to have to pay. There are, obviously, if there's a lender, there's going to be lender fees. All these things add up. Someone's got to do the math, right? So you can't just show up, with a blank check. I hope you can, but these are things that a buyer's attorney does. If a buyer's not using an attorney on a FSBO, on a for sale by owner situation, someone's got to do that math and figure it out. So what I'd recommend if you are a buyer on a for sale by owner transaction is to absolutely retain an attorney, even though it costs $2,000 to $3,000. That's another thing you're going to have to pay. I think it's important that you're represented and that the seller is too. If the seller isn't, then you better make sure that your attorney prepares a very, very clear affidavit that the seller is choosing not to be represented, and your attorney has to know that he has to do the seller's attorney's job, which is not so simple. It is not simple. It's a lot of work that he's not going to think about. It's a process. The transactions are not quick in New York. Title can take a month to come and for it to come in, and then there's other issues coming in. So you've got to be on top of these things. And if you're the only attorney on the transaction, then you're going to handle all that stuff. So I hope this was helpful. If you are interested in all the ways I can help you, go to howtoflipnewyork.com. If you are interested in finding out more about a course I teach about that I have that teaches how to do what I do, go to howtoflipnewyorkcourse.com. If you are interested in finding out more about one-on-one coaching, go to coaching.howtoflipnewyork.com. And please keep the comments coming. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe. Please click the thumbs up. Those really help me. And the comments really help me. I go live 5 times a week, and I don't always know what to say. The comments give me topics to discuss. You can ask any comment. It doesn't have to be about the video you're watching, and I reply to all the comments usually within a day. So thank you very, very much for watching.